All right. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good night. Um, for tonight's video, we are tasked with discussing our research project, our findings, and our conclusion. I've greatly enjoyed this class, and since I study civil conflict and revolution for a living, I learned quite a bit of relevant information. So, my research project is part of a much larger project. This primary goal is to create a model that can be used to aid in understanding the onset of civil conflict in any nation. So, to do this, I'm doing a comparative study of historical instances of civil conflict in hopes that I can find universal themes or conditions that drive nations into war, right? Um, I like to think that I'm innovative. I am in reality, I'm standing on the backs of some great scholars. Jack Goldstone, Peter Turchin, Paul Collier, Anka Hoffler, they've all written works on this subject and have done quite a lot. They've created quite a lot of models. Um, the issue I see in their work is that they mainly concentrate on instances of civil conflict between the years 1960 and 1999. So post Cold War. Um, Turchin discussed some older civil conflicts, and Goldstone had a book on conflicts in the of rebellion in the early modern period. But they really didn't do a deep dive into the subject, so I don't know that they're as in depth as they need to be. And it's one of the reasons I think their models have kind of not been as useful as they could have been. So, um, so Um, I decided that this is what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to analyze these conflicts. And I've done a couple. I did the American Civil War. I've got some stuff on the Taiping Rebellion. I did the rebellion in Haiti already. Um, uh, uh, I'm about to start working on the English Civil War. I did the French Revolution. And this class has provided me the opportunity to really dig into the American Revolution. So that's what I chose to do for this class. In this research project, I propose that the modern quantitative models of civil conflict will fall short. I found this in other instances of historical civil conflict, that the modern modeling doesn't doesn't really they don't fit well. My reasoning for believing this relies on the heavy usage of Cold War era civil conflicts, right? So the Cold War is a very unique period in history. We have two major global powers fighting for domination of the world. Now, you could easily say that that's not true, but for for the sake of brevity right now, we're just going to continue on with that. Um, so to determine if the models would work, I chose the two most prominent models, which is the quantitative model of Civil War onset and then Peter Turchin's secular model. And I try to use them to analyze the American Revolution to see if there was any gaps. So out of this, I found that uh, these two models they work perfectly for this study because they're the most all-encompassing of the models. Um, but they still didn't hold true. So just so you understand, the quantitative model of Civil War onset is probably the most in-depth study on civil conflict. So it's done by Paul Collier and Anka Hoffler, and they contend that revolutions and civil conflicts are not about grievances, which is a big thing. Most people who study Civil War, they look for the grievances, right? Why were people mad enough to go to war? But the reality is grievance-based rebellions are very rare. They're exceedingly rare. Most rebellions or instances of civil conflict are actually greed based, right? So in this model that they created, they looked for key conditions. So they found that geographic isolation was a big one, economic downturn in the previous, 10 or so years, demographic imbalance, a commodity dependence was a big factor. So once commodity exports reach, if one, like say for instance, cotton in the American South, is 60% of the U.S. GDP was made up of cotton exports, right? So the over dependence on one export made those uh, the southern cotton plantations extremely lucrative, but also put them in a situation where everybody was trying to take money from them or to take them over so they could redistribute the profits. Um, Another one is lower education levels and then a preceding conflict, which you do find. Like in the American Revolution, it was just right after the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, depending on what side of the pond you're on. So the fact that there was just prior to the American Revolution a major conflict, and then you have all the Indian Wars, it kind of primed the population. They get tired of, you find it mainly in governments that don't really operate well in the preceding war, or if there's unfinished business. And you find that in the American Revolution. Like the colonists were infuriated by the end of the 7 Years' War. So, um, so the total exports of the 13 colonies only were 25 to 30% of their overall GDP. So in any state, there was not one commodity that rose above the 20% mark, right? So in the Collier-Hoffler model, they state that anytime you find an export commodity that reaches 25% of the total GDP of a nation, that nation has a 50% higher chance of falling into civil conflict. Well, that wasn't the case in the American Revolution. It, like I said before, is the Civil War. Cotton made up 60% of the national GDP, so it rose the level of the probability of conflict to where it was just too high to manage. And it's interesting because when I did the study on the Civil War, you can see it start in 1800, and every 10 years you can see the amount that cotton makes up of the national GDP continue to rise. So, um, interestingly enough, at this time too, New England was the poorest region. So the American Revolution seems to really kick off in New England. That's where it got really hard and heavy. But part of that's because of the poverty, I would imagine, of the region. New England's kind of in a bowl. It can take in a lot of immigrants because it's close to New York, but there's no place for those immigrants to expand west. So most immigration within or migration within the country during this time, if you landed in New England, you migrated through the South and around the Appalachians. Well, only so many people are going to do that. So it becomes one big bowl where manpower gets uh, fills it up. They get an excessive population, but not an economy big enough to support that population. Whereas the South was different. The South had vast lands and abundant resources, but a minimal population because of the amount of deaths by disease. So the next one was geographic isolation, and geographic isolation does exist in the American Revolution, not in the same way that they talk about, but the Atlantic Ocean is a huge geographic barrier that allowed them the ability to really secede, right? That's what they did. They seceded from Great Britain. Um, so the presence of a diaspora is a big deal. I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce that word. I've heard diaspora, diaspora, but anyways, it was not really found. Now, in their work, they say that a foreign actor could take this place, and the French did. ate us a little bit, but not in the manner that a diaspora would have. Like, if you look at other revolutions in contemporary times, you can look right now what's going on in Israel between Israel and Hamas, right? They have vast diasporas all around the world, and they're dumping millions of dollars into this conflict on whichever side they belong. That didn't really happen in the American Revolution. So in Turchin's work, he claims that elite overproduction, social contract disintegration, economic conditions like an economic downturn, a depression, recession, wage difference, the wage gap, um, and elite dynamics are the main drivers of conflict. Now, he also has a thing on secular cycles. It's a little bit too much for this video. I'm already way over the time. Um, so you do find, according to his work, the elite overproduction did occur. The amount of elites in North America rose drastically at the end of the 7 Years' War. We were producing more lawyers every year. The amount of wealth and wealthy landowners was rising drastically in the country. Well, when you have that population of people, they want to fight for the top jobs. Well, there's only so many top jobs. And instead of picking colonists to hold those positions, England was using people from England that they trusted to hold those positions, for one. And then for two, there was no representation from the American colonies in Parliament. So you could be wealthy as a lord in North America. You could own all the land. You could have all the people dependent on you. You could be the arbiter of justice in your area, but you were never going to get granted the full rights to be a member of Parliament, which is basically makes you a lord, right? It rises you to the noble class, and that was just not happening for people in the 13 colonies. So anyways, this competition for the small amount of chairs is the elite dynamics. It's like musical chairs, but instead of taking chairs away, you just keep adding players. Eventually the players all start fighting for the limited number of chairs, right? Um, Now the social contract really was not disintegrating, right? We like to think it was because we hear taxation without representation and all this stuff. The social contract uh, of Britain at the time had remained the same. It had not changed. The difference was our views, American views on the social contract had changed, for one. And then for two, England was in a transition period. We like to think that there's a big gap there, but 2 generations prior to the American Revolution, or 3 generations prior, they were in the Civil War period. And then they had the Jacobite uprisings and all that. And their kings, the family line had changed 3 times, and they didn't know what was next, right? So everything seemed like it was in a transition, which probably put more stress on the American colonists at the time, anyways. Um, So because of this transition, that's why you prominently hear taxation without representation throughout the whole conflicts, because to them, they were trying to justify that they were fighting for this social order that was already gone, right? In their mind, they're like it was falling apart. But the reality was it was not. Um, so the big kicker that I found in this is that commodities tend to be the main driver of conflict. Uh, a nation dependent upon these export commodities is normally doomed to conflict. You see it all over Africa, the Middle East. The countries they produce oil is 90% of their economy, and then they wonder why they're always in civil conflict. Just because if you want to be wealthy, you have to fight for a limited number of jobs in the oil field, right? So the same kind of thing happens with other commodities too. Um, while I did not find this to be the case in the American Revolution, it did get me thinking, which furthers my view here that, mercantilism and the royal monopolies, they really caused issues. So, what a monopoly would get granted, these royal companies would get granted, like the East India Company, right? They got granted rights to all the shipping in North America of tea. And then they changed the regulations once they got in that position to ensure that they had no competition. Well, in doing that, you just put out of work a whole bunch of sailors in Boston. It was pretty interesting that the revolution really, really got hot and heavy in Boston really quick. You got a bunch of out of work men. They feel like they're not getting their fair share of the market, and it's not because we only had one commodity that we were depending on, but we were depending on that service, right, on the shipping. So another thing that I found that I'm not sure how ties in is there were a series of epidemics in North America from 1759 to 1782. And while it was only a small percentage, it was like 11,000 people died from the smallpox epidemic between 1775 and 1782. That's only 0.44% of the population. So it's not a lot, right? But these places were centered around towns that 11,000 people was a lot of people in these general regions. So I wonder how much these epidemics, the stressors from them, created issues. So, anyways, I'm not done typing up my project yet. I'm finishing it up this weekend so I can turn it in. And I know this video ran long, but this was a very detailed topic, and I felt I had to do some explaining. Otherwise, people would think I was just crazy. Anyways, I hope everybody has a good night, and I can't wait to see your videos. All right. Good night.